Good evening, everyone, and welcome. You're with Sarah from Westminster Libraries and Archives, and I'm joined by Kate Macdonald, historian and director of Handheld Press. And today we also have guest and author Nicola Griffith. As you can see by the screen, we are diving into writing the Anglo-Saxons with Nicola Griffith. And without further ado, I will hand over to Kate and Nicola.
My name is Kate Macdonald. I am the director of Handheld Press, and I have known Nicola for over 10 years. I first encountered Nicola when she was writing Hild, and more recently, I have been very pleased to be able to help a tiny bit towards the end of this book. And we have also published, Nicola. We did the UK edition of So Lucky, which also was a great privilege. It was at the beginning of Handheld's trajectory as a publisher. What I'm going to do, I'm going to assume that most people here don't actually know who Nicola is. So we'll do a start of about 5 minutes of preamble to give you an introduction, and then I'm going to move into the questions. So Nicola is a British author from Yorkshire, now living and working in Seattle. And she is an award-winning writer many, many, many times over. She's published 9 novels, a lot of short fiction and memoir, and she is constantly norming the other in every single thing that she writes, teaches, does, or advocates for. I'm going to give you a quick summary of the novels, roughly in order, so you get a sense of the kind of stuff she's been interested in the past and what she's been doing recently. So the first novel was Ammonite, science fiction from 1992. It's set on a planet that has a virus that kills men, so it's packed with gender and colonialism ideas. Then there was Slow River, 1995, another science fiction novel about water and waste and betrayal, pollution remediation and predatory capitalism. I've lifted those phrases from her website. And then there were 3 absolutely stunning lesbian noir crime thrillers: The Blue Place, Stay, and Always from 1998, 2002, 2007, starring a 6-foot Nordic ex-police detective and martial arts practitioner Aud Torvingen. Sadly, those 3 are out of print, but I hear there may be chances of getting them back into print. And I do hope they will, because they are incredible. Then we have So Lucky, 2018, about finding community while fighting society's dismissal of disability. Then there was Spear, an award-winning queer reimagining of the Arthurian stories. And that, until Menewood, was the most recent. I'm going to bounce back a bit now. Back in 2013, Hild came out, which was Nicola's first historical novel, set in a dangerous Anglo-Saxon world. And the sequel, Menewood, came out towards the end of last year. Additionally, Nicola was awarded a PhD by publication in 2017 by Anglia Ruskin University. So this is a rich and significant body of work. And if you want to read about how Nicola says she wants to make you feel when you read her work, look at the About page on her website, which is really quite forceful. So now let's get on to the Anglo-Saxons. I'm going to give you a quick summary of the 2 novels we're going to be talking about, Hild and Menewood. So they're both set in the historical 7th century on the eastern side of the main island of Britain, focusing on the life of the woman who would become known as Hilda of Whitby. She was a real person, Hilda of Whitby. She was born in 614 and she died in 680, and she was a royal kinswoman, the great niece of Edwin of Bernicia, in whose court she grew up. That's all we know about her, apart from the fact that she organised the Synod of Whitby in the later 660, 670-ish, which hopefully the novels will reach. The only historical sources for Hild's life are from Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, which was was available about 50 years after she died. And there are massive gaps. While Bede may have met people who had known Hild, he and his church had their own agenda, but that's all the history we have. And so the novel Hild doesn't so much reimagine Anglo-Saxon society as recreate it. It uses the archaeological record and inserts highly plausible possibilities into the gaps that are left. Nicola has presented a version of how the Anglo-Saxons of all social levels lived their lives, their attitudes to sex and love and loyalty, the political and social dimensions of religion, and belief in the ways to manipulate political power. So the character Hild begins the novel as a toddler with a keen awareness of the sights and smells and sounds of the world around her. She grows up into a leggy, muscular child with a preternatural capacity to persuade others through observation, empathy, and sharp intelligence. She is developed, and I say that verb structure advisedly, into the role of the king's seer as a pre-adolescent. Then she's taken into battle. She learns how to be friends with other children. She learns her place in the extremely dangerous world of Anglo-Saxon rivalries, and she learns about sex. Through Hild's growing life, we are utterly immersed in the Anglo-Saxon world, and the novel ends when she's about 18 in about 630. Menewood begins a few months later, and Menewood is a place name. Hild is married and she's developing her own small kingdom in the valley of Menewood in Elmet, which is south of present-day Leeds in Yorkshire, which is halfway up the island of Britain. Edwin summons Hild to attend him on the eve of the Battle of Hatfield Chase in 633, which she barely survives. She recovers, regroups, redevelops her own kingdom in hiding, and chooses to become the chief strategist and war leader for Oswald of Bernicia at the Battle of Heavenfield in 634. So Menewood is also a total immersion into Anglo-Saxon life, politics, farming, settlement, and political history. And it chooses what it uses with great care. And it's really hard to come out of reading both these novels thinking that these are not true. It just reads like life. So for my first question, Nicola, I'm going to be, as I've already told you in advance, I'm going to be using Rosemary Sutcliffe's historical writing as a jumping off point because I recently read her novel, The Shining Company of 1990, and she used the Welsh poem Igodan, which was the basis for the novel. And that retells the story of the Battle of Catref. I cannot pronounce that right, but you know the one I mean, around about 600. This was a big battle between the Britons and the Angles, in which Athelfrith, who was the brother-in-law of Edwin of Bernicia, and the man who sent Edwin into exile, which happens before the novel Hild begins, and Athelfrith defeats the British attack. And its historical setting predates the opening of Hild by about 15 years, which really interested me because we have two very different approaches to how you write about society in Britain. Sutcliffe took the British side, you focused on the Anglo-Saxon. But before we get into the Saxons, I've got to get this out of the way. Apparently, the poem mentions the first mention of King Arthur in British literature. So in Hild, the novel, Hild's foster brother Cian, he constantly reenacts the fighting in Igodan in their childhood fighting games. So is King Arthur in those games too? Or would Anglo-Saxon children have had no knowledge of Arthur? What do you think?
Okay. We don't actually know when Igodan was written. So let's say somewhere between 585 and 605. I think Cian would have known this poem as basically a childhood version of a fantastic pop song, a hero song, the kind of thing that, you know, everyone's sitting around in the hall getting wasted on their mead and beer and singing along with. It was a lifestyle. It was an aspirational thing for him, and to a lesser degree for Hild. So Arthur, there is a mention of Arthur, and there are many, many Arthurs in the genealogies north of Hadrian's Wall in the early 7th century. There are some historians who argue, I think fairly tongue-in-cheek, that Arthur was just a cattle thief, basically. During the really bad winter of, I think, 537, there was a couple of volcanic eruptions and 2 summers of no sun and no harvest, and everyone starved, and it was just terrible. Some people have called it the worst year to have been alive in Northwest Europe. And so there's one argument that Arthur was just a sort of chieftain and he kept his people alive and became a hero by raiding everybody else and taking cattle, which to me is like, yeah, okay, it's good for keeping his people alive, but pretty sad for everybody else. So there's a mention about how these fantastic, heroic people, well, they're brilliant, but they're no Arthur. And that's pretty much all it says. So is it one of the Arthurs who was a raiding cattle chief, and that then got mixed up with the whole set of Arthurian mythos from Wales, and then became the Arthur we know today? Or what? I have no idea. I think that's why Arthur is so fascinating. I had just never even considered what Cian and Hild might have thought or known of any kind of Arthur. That's really interesting. My poor brain is just going like this now.
Sorry to dump that on you.
No,
Okay,
no. It was interesting. It's a good way to begin.
Okay, right. So, Igodan is a Welsh poem in Welsh, and the Royal Anglo-Saxon children, which is Hild and her sister, and then Cian, who is not royal because that's part of the plot, they know it by heart. So, can you describe how you depict in Hild the mingling of the Anglo-Saxon, the British, and the Irish peoples? Because we have three languages moving in and out, as well as dialects of some of the languages, and the children grow up trilingual effectively. How did you work that out in the novel, and how did you think you needed to balance it, some bits being more Anglo-Saxon than others?
For me, the languages was very much a kind of class indicator. The way I imagined the 7th century in that part of the world, in Elmet and then Deira, I saw it as very much the Anglish. I hate using the term Anglo-Saxon, so I'm just going to call them the Anglish. The Anglish were the ones in power. They were top of the social tree, top of the aristocratic tree. They had all the money, all the land, all the power. And so I thought of Old English, of, let's say, Anglish, the language they were speaking, as the language of, I guess, to put it really in a binary terms, the language of the predator. Simple, clear, straightforward. You don't have to hide in the shadows. You just go straight for what you want. It's like, I want that, I'm going to take that. So very blunt, just as I think the best words really are kind of short and hard and clean. I mean, so many Old English words are still with us. Things like book, mother, father, and so on. They are Anglish words. And the way we speak today is mostly from that. But then every now and again, there are some parts of the world where the phrasing is much more British, that is Brittonic, which is basically the precursor to Welsh and Cumbric and Breton. And that is very periphrastic and roundabout. And so I started to think that probably those children who grew up with British background, they would have been very much the underdogs. And so their language would have reflected more the side of being a prey animal, much more elusive, much more moving from shadow to shadow, much more circumspect. And so for me, that's, I used it as a character tool and a class indicator, and also just a way of showing cultural difference. In terms of Irish, Hild learnt Irish when she was about 9 or 10, but Cian never did.
Yeah, because Hild, there are some key moments in both novels where Hild makes use of the fact that nobody expects her to know language A or B, and listens in and then surprises and uses that as a fulcrum, a lever to give herself power and advantage. And these are just delightful because obviously the reader knows that Hild understands. I'm also thinking in Menewood, there's the character who Hild really underestimates, and it's almost the only character she does underestimate, and the revelation is based on the language he reveals.
Yeah, that was, I really enjoyed writing that. I mean, I didn't know he was going to assume such a large part. but the character's name initially, as we know it, is Marlo. And we think he's in northern Britain. And it turns out that he really outfoxes Hild in this way. And it's true manipulation. It's not manipulation by silence. It's actual deceptive practice. And he's very, very good at it. And he turns out to be neither good nor bad, but just not what Hild had expected. So that was fun. I always
Yeah.
love these little unexpected gifts that you give as a writer. You give yourself all these clues as you're going, and it's only later that you see how it all fits together. I love that thing about writing. So much of it is in the deep subconscious.
And that point with Marlo, that because he outfoxes Hild, their relations later on, which are political negotiation relations, are now transformed, because the reader can no longer depend on Hild being likeliest to be the winner, likeliest to get what she wants. So it adds a real tension. This earlier episode adds a tension to the much later important developments. Which that must have been a terrific gift from the writing. Oh, this works too. Now, the details of the domestic organization of the Anglo-Saxon vills that Edwin's household moves between are absolutely stunning. In one of my earlier lives, I was an editor for English Heritage, and we worked on the monographs that were for nationally funded excavations. And I was at English Heritage in the office for about 3 years, and Yavering was the book that would not die. And Yavering, to my great delight, was where Hild spends a lot of her time. And Yavering as a summer place, isn't it? It's a place where harvest and crops are processed and so on. What's the difference between the different vills Edwin's court moves among? Because you've got Yavering, you've got York, you've got Menewood itself, which is more Hild's than anyone else's, and then you've got the royal vill now called Sutton Hoo, which they visit. And then you have the tiny headland settlement where Beggo and Mulstan come from. So how did you arrange them in your mind for depicting the civilizations?
For me, vills are in different places for different reasons. So there are some vills like Goodmanham. That was basically the heart of Edwin's base, if you like. It's where he came from culturally. It was the heart of their religious practice. So that was definitely farming country. That was grain country. That was where you went for the harvest. That was where you relaxed and let out your belt, and you had the feasts and all the people came to you, and basically life was good. That was that feeling. And then you have something like Yevering or Yavering, I've never figured out how to pronounce it. And that is much more border country. It's much more edge land at the beginning of Edwin's reign, because things were still not easy. I mean, like the Godolphin, basically, they came from Dunedin, Edinburgh. And so the clash was in the north. And so the north of Edwin's kingdom was much more recently subdued, let me put it that way. It was more like a frontier place. And so there it was all about being impressive. It was the monumental buildings. It was the giant hill. And that was where I imagined that the British would bring their cattle, their renders, basically their yearly tithe. So to me, that place was more a March, April kind of thing. And Bebbanburg, and that was the fastness in the north. That was like, we can hang out here when everyone's starving. If it's a bad winter and no one has any food and they decide to upend the social compact, we're going to be safe here because no one can ever break Bebbanburg. So that was that was the hungry February months. So each of these places took on that kind of characteristic for me. So I designed it thinking A, of what I knew of the material evidence, and B, for what I needed for the plot. And then that all came together to influence what the characters did. So it was this hugely organic process for me. I didn't sit down and think, okay, this needs to happen, therefore they need to be in this place. It was more like, so here's the yearly round of spring, harvest, winter. How will they feel at these times? When is war more likely to happen? How will it feel physically? And will it be all about stone or wood or sea breezes or gentle zephyrs in the trees? So it just, I was just living in it and moving through it as much as consciously shaping it.
Yes, the section in Hild where Hild goes shopping for the first time, that she's been she's been given silver. They're at Radwald's great royal court in Sutton Hoo, for want of a better term, and she's been given silver, and she can go, and she doesn't realize, oh my goodness, I can spend this. And she's told about hack silver, which is basically getting change, and you can buy these presents for people. And that's when she meets Uladas, who is the most important person in her life, who's not a relative, I think. Yes, it's just a fabulous, fabulous section of the novel, because we get the joy of shopping, but we are introduced to everything that the Anglo-Saxons, the English, and their traders in the northwest of the Europe can supply to a royal court. It's just wonderful, wonderfully imagined, but not from nothing.
I really loved writing that scene, actually. I thought about all the grave lists I'd seen in various digs, and I thought, oh, I could use that, I could use that, I could use this. And of course, then I had to characterize the fact that the Emporium down there in East Anglia was going to be trading with a very different part of the world than when Edwin sets up his witch in York. It's like the Baltics versus the Mediterranean. It was different goods, different styles.
Oh, it's just fun. It was intoxicating, that section. Hugely enjoyable. Right, birds. So Hild spends a lot of time observing the natural world, plant growth, bird and animal habits, and climatic conditions and how they affect landscape. And for her, this information is life-saving and essential, but somehow few other characters have the same observational and synthesizing skills that she does. So this is a mechanism that sets her apart in the narrative, that she's able to see and read where others cannot. But it's also, because the reader can understand what she's doing, we are reassured that her knowledge is grounded and it's true. But where did you get the information from? Were you scouring through natural history guides? And also, how did you stop yourself mapping North American birds and animals and flowers that you might know now into early medieval York?
The answer is simple to both of those questions, and it is one book called The Birds of Yorkshire, written in right at the end of the 19th century.
Lovely, yeah.
And I found this book, and I'm like, fabulous, and it talks in such knowledgeable ways about all these different birds and then interesting things that happen. So I got this idea of those two different kinds of birds' eggs being in the same nest from this book, and I thought, oh my God, this is a great way to do a prophecy. And there was something about the tone, the archaic tone of that book that really helped. But then also, of course, I started to do a lot of research about the flora and fauna, for the simple reason that, so for example, I was thinking, okay, they weren't like the Romans. They didn't have a lot of ceramics. So they would have used different woods for different drinking vessels. And I thought, well, what kind of wood would they use to put, for example, milk in? Because you can't put it in oak because bad taste, right? There are certain woods impart certain tastes. Certain woods work well for things and others don't. Maple is usually smaller, so the royal people would have that lovely smooth grained maple. And then I thought, okay, sycamore. And then but I thought, well, So I went to look it up just to be safe. And it turned out, no, sycamore were imported to Britain in, I think, the 16th century.
Close. So close.
Exactly. So after that, I thought, every time I thought Hild saw something or was watching something, I thought, but did it exist? So I would have to go check. And then I got fascinated. I started to keep these calendars about when this would flower and when that would drop and when these animals were mating on these giving birth and these. And so I built this whole natural calendar for myself. And then because I had to do a different one for each of the places she went.
Yeah.
What are the seals doing now? Don't care about rooks here. We need seals. So I learned a lot. I mean, of course, then I forget it. So people often think I'm an expert in birds, and I'm like, I have no idea. I have no idea what that bird is. I am so sorry. Use your app.
I did some research once about another author writing about natural history, and I worked out that because he had completely forgotten that where he came from in the north of Scotland, the seasons are a bit later and the birds nest later. So he's having birds nesting at the wrong time for Oxfordshire, which was really very pleasurable to discover. So, magic. There is no magic in Hild or Menewood. They're not that kind of book. But some of the descriptions are close to magical. For example, when Edwin's eyes change, when he's absolutely furious or greedy, the black spreads from the pupil into the green of the iris. So Hild's own story is close to being a magical Bildungsroman, the arc of her life, in which she is believed to be working magic, but she does nothing of the kind. Everybody thinks that she does magic, and that's how, and it's dreadful for her in many ways. So you make knowledge and its application a magical process, which your peers in fantasy writing appreciate, because this is how the Anglo-Saxons would have viewed what Hild was doing. So can you talk about the boundaries between magic and knowledge and seeing and believing? How did you work with that?
I'm not sure what my conscious process was, but for me, the whole thing began with her as a 3-year-old. And to a 3-year-old, everything is fresh and new. Everything is kind of miraculous and magical. When Hild finally realizes that things happen in a certain order, like birds are fighting. Why are they fighting? Why are they flying together? And then, oh, look, now there are eggs in a nest. And then a little later, there'll be fledglings. And then there'll be birds. And then they'll start fighting again. And then, so that was a kind of magic for her. It was as mystical to her as people praying to their various gods. So for me, I just really wanted to convey this sense of the wild magic of the landscape, just this sense of what a miracle the world itself is, and how if you don't understand the natural process and the rhythms of things, it would seem much more supernatural, much more miraculous, because, Hild could say, well, I can tell you that 2 weeks from now, there's going to be greenfinches in that tree. And anyone who hadn't been paying attention, they'd be like, you must be a seer. You must be able to foretell the future. And in a way, of course, in this sense, she totally could, because she knew, she's been there 3 years in a row, that the greenfinches are going to be there, because that's where they go at that time of year. So for me, it was just a question of resetting the label of what magic is. So Hild knew it wasn't magic, but the other people thought it was. And that was, of course, also played into the genre readership. I mean, I have always read historical fiction. I've always read fantasy. So to me, they're part and parcel of the same thing. And then, of course, they're speaking of Rosemary Sutcliffe, and more particularly right this minute, Mary Stuart. Mary Stuart, with her Crystal Cave and other Merlin books, really melds the landscape and natural world with Merlin's supernatural abilities. So for me, they were very entwined. Because I was running these books as a giant controlled experiment about women's role in history, it was very important to me that I do not contravene what's known to be known. So that's why I couldn't actually use magic. So to me, I use nature to take the place.
And close observation. Hild's mother Bregaswith, she is the only other one who, not the only other one, she's the only major character who sees what Hild sees, and she expects Hild to observe the way Bregaswith has taught her. But they're the only major characters that do that. Is everybody else just too busy, or too busy trying to survive, or they simply don't have the special something that these two royal women have?
I don't know. I think there are probably other people who notice other things. They notice them differently. One of the things I used to teach in creative writing was how you build character through what that character observes and what they do with that observation. And one of the examples I used to use is, okay, you put someone in a forest. What do they see? It depends on the person. It depends on how they're feeling. So we begin with the 3-year-old Hild, and she just loves being in quiet places. She loves being on her own. She loves the smells and sounds of nature. And so she pays attention to that. She has that time. She's a royal child. She has the time, and she's safe to do it because there's always someone watching her on some level. Whereas Cian, he's less safe, and also he's a boy who's very interested in becoming a warrior. So he would go into a wood and he wouldn't see the birds, the bees, the trees. He would see a place where you could dig a ditch and trip the horses up. People see what matters to them. And I think Bregaswith learned very early that royal women had certain expectations put upon them to run the household, to be the healer, to be the advisor to the head of the household, basically the woman's husband. And for that, you do need a political sense. And so you need to observe people. She didn't observe nature as much as Hild. She observed people more. She taught Hild how to transfer her natural observations to social observations, I think.
Yeah. Hild thinks she sees an elf when she's very young. There's a pool in the wood under the bird cherry tree. And much later in Menewood, Hild goes back to that pool and the elf's not there. And it's a kind of scene of letting go of childhood beliefs, or that's behind me now and moving on. But that led me to think more about Hild and her spiritual beliefs. So you're foregrounding in both novels the impending political clash between the two different Christian camps that Hild is going to have to negotiate in her later life. You've got the Irish priests and you've got the Augustinian priests coming from Rome. And you're showing how the subtle and pragmatic acceptance of Christianity might have had to be. So, for example, in Hild, you've got Edwin pitting his new Christian bishop against his pagan god speaker, and Woden loses because Edwin's new queen is Christian and he knows where the power is. And in Menewood, the troops under Oswald have to listen to a Christian mass before going into battle. And some believe it, some don't, some really couldn't care less. And Hild stays clear of this, but it's quite clear in Menewood that she's really beginning to develop her own spirituality, which I still think is possibly connected to going to see if the elf's there. No, okay, it's not. We know Hild's story has to end with her leading a Christian institution because that's history. How are you pacing this? How long is it going to take her? She's only just 20, and she's achieved so much in the way of war and politics and dreadful life experiences we won't mention here. She's only 20, and yet we've got, I don't know, how many, 40 years to go? That's a long time yet, isn't
46,
there?
yeah.
46.
Yeah. So how am I pacing it? The answer is, I think I have now done a lot of the persuading of the readers that Hild can move mountains, that Hild is extraordinary, that Hild understands politics, that Hild has these particular skill sets. So Menewood is just a truly massive book, but I will never have to do the work I did in Menewood again. In future books, I can say, and so she moved in here and built a community, and it was like this. And people will believe me. I'll be like, she did what she did in the ballot. Boom, done. I won't have to spend 100 pages saying how she did it or why she did it or how hard it was. It'll just be jump cut and ta-da! 2 years later, beautifully functioning community. So I will be able to, I'm hoping, this is the theory. How the practice is going to work, I have no idea. But my hope is that I'll be able to really do a lot of jump cuts. Now, I mean, so right now I haven't started writing the next Hild book because I'm trying to decide just how much more of the long, detailed stuff I need to do. Like, can I just now do another jump cut 7 years from now, like a year before Oswald meets his maker? Or what? I mean, but I could see ways I could do that. But I also see so many interesting things I'd love to talk about during that time. So for me now, it's going to become a question of what research is available, what interests me, what more does Hild need to learn to become the person that history tells us she was, and what do I find thrilling? What would readers enjoy?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't honestly. If I keep going at this pace, I'll be 120 by the time I do finish the last book, and I would rather get there a little bit more quickly. So my hope is that I think I have at least 2 more Hild books to go, maybe 3, but I would like to keep it to 2.
Yeah.
The problem is if I keep it to 2, they'll be big books, and big books are a difficult sell in the world right now. People prefer smaller ones. So maybe I'll do 3 shorter ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
I am looking forward to seeing how Hild negotiates the Christian environment, because either she has to treat, this is what I think, treat Christianity and her acceptance of it and her career path in that world, becoming an abbess, as purely a political decision, managing and negotiating with men largely, or she has a supernatural experience, in which case magic is thus brought into the book. And I'm going to be so interested to see how you handle that, how you give us credence that Hild really is Christian, or she really is a political operator who just happens to wear an abbess's uniform. I hope that makes sense.
It does. I am thinking now of some of the nuns and priests. I grew up Catholic, that I have known. And I know there was one priest in particular who made a big impression on me. His name was Father Lucy. He was the chaplain at the grammar school I went to. And grammar school in the UK, for anyone in the US who's listening, is the school you go to or used to be from age 11 to 18. It's high school and middle school sort of smushed together. And it was a Catholic convent school. So, you know, I was a nice little Catholic girl with the uniform. And but I'm also a right old dyke. So, you know,
Awkward.
by the time I was 15, 16, I was very active with my girlfriend, and we actually got caught in flagrante delicto on the chaplain's desk at school. And so there was a big school assembly, and me and my girlfriend were sent out of the room to go see Father Lucy. And so we were in there and thinking, my girlfriend Una was saying, we're going to go to hell. And I'm thinking, we're going to be expelled. But we get there, and Father Lucy is basically, he was Irish. He's like, sit down. Plain or chocolate? And I'm like, what? He says, plain or chocolate? Biscuits. With your tea. We're having tea? Biscuits. Chocolate, please. But eventually, you know, we were sitting there with our tea and biscuits, like, what is going on here? And he said, so, do you love each other? And we're like, yeah, thinking, is this a trap? He said, well, that's all right then. And we're like, what's going on? He said, well, you know, God is love. So loving each other, it's just fine. Just fine. Just be a little more discreet. That was it.
What a man.
We drank our tea, we ate our biscuits, we went back into our lessons. I got home from school, and my mother's like, looked like she'd been chewing a lemon, and she's like, I hear that you are the shame of the school. My name has been, and I'm like, priest said it was okay, Mom. He said God's love. And she couldn't refute that God is love. And she was just, and I thought, this is the way forward. I mean, I think Deacon James in the Hild books
He's just delightful.
is Hild's role model in a particular way for how God thinks and works. Whereas Furzy is Hild's role model in terms of the power of the church. So she's going to formulate a kind of blend of those things. And to me, it's already really clear that Hild does believe and feels this ineffable thing. And she calls it the pattern. And I don't think it's going to be very hard for her to just map one on top of the other and ignore, just like Father Lucy did, just ignore the parts that don't fit, don't sit. Especially early on, when the church is very fluid.
Good. I look forward to reading it. I think now we should stop and see if anyone has any questions. Sarah, could you open the floodgates?
Okay, yes, we have a few questions actually.
Excellent.
So the first one, I believe, is for Nicola. The question is, why do you hate calling the English Anglo-Saxons?
Because of the way the term Anglo-Saxon has been politicized. It has been racialized. It has been used as a tool of nationalism for a long time. It's been used and abused in ways that that I feel gender politics in, quote, the Dark Ages, unquote, has also been used and abused. So you get TV shows all about the Anglo-Saxons, who are all tall, manly, straight, white, noble, square-jawed men. And that's what the nation is. Because Anglo-Saxons are conquerors, it means that these literally Anglo-Saxons are better than anybody else. And it has assumed a really bad taste in my mind. I just don't like using it. And plus, honestly, the people back then, the people Hild would have known, would not have called themselves Anglo-Saxons. There would have been the Saxons, there were the British, there were the Angles, there were the Bernicians, there were the Brunei, there were the Irish, the Scots. Nobody at that time would have called themselves Anglo-Saxons. So it's partly a political decision on my part and partly a historical realism issue.
Before I go to the next question, I just want to ask, do you think that maybe by calling them Anglo-Saxons, they grouped all of those different groups under one umbrella rather than having so many names?
Yeah, I mean, it's a shorthand that has been appropriated by basically white nationalists, and it is inaccurate and distasteful to me.
The next question is, there's a bit to it afterwards, but they are a cheesemaker and a long-time wool worker, and they was over the moon reading Hild with your marvelous descriptions of daily life, night and day compared with so many of the other historical novels I've read. It's not all swords and pissing contests. It's cream on the forearm or a spindle in the hand. So the question is, do you have any personal experience of textiles or experimental archaeology?
No. In terms of archaeology, my very, very, very first paid job, it was when I was 15, and I worked on an archaeological dig, digging up a Roman villa in Helmsley in North Yorkshire. I mean, all the good stuff had already been lifted by then, so I was just a labourer. I would go in with a pickaxe, basically take it down 6 inches, and off I'd go, and whomp, 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 wheelbarrows, and then the people would come with their little brushes and and take pictures, and then it's like, bring in the laborers again. Whoop, whoop. That was me. So I understood archaeology as a very physical thing. And so I was always much more interested in material culture than documented history, because that was, who was writing this stuff. Wasn't it people with agendas? Whereas with archaeology, you get to see much more parts of society. But to the experimental archaeology thing, I think to some degree, many science fiction writers do that intellectually. They don't do it with their hands so much, but we will build, we test things in our heads all the time. If you're building an alien planet, you have to figure out how things work. You have to figure out the economics, the weather, the best way to use the materials to hand. But in terms of Hild and particularly textile production, for me, the key to all that was, it was just about a year before I started writing the book, I'd done all this research. And I came across a book by Penelope Walton Rogers called Something in Textiles in Anglo-Saxon England, 450 to 600. And she posited from her archaeological investigations that English women spent 65% of their day on textile production. And I thought, well, that's more than sleep, childcare, and food preparation put together. So how could that possibly have worked? And that's when it became so clear to me that this was a continual process, and they would have to do it with everything. They would have to do it while they cooked. They would have to do it while they talked. They would have to do it while they cleaned their kids up after they fell in the mud. They would have to do it all the time, endlessly. And then that in turn led me to this notion of the concept of yemachi, because I thought, how can you tablet weave, for example, and look after a young child at the same time? The answer is you can't, that you need two of you. So preferably the same cultural status, the same number of kids, the same age. So you both have 3-year-olds or you both have 5-year-olds. And one can be the main watcher while holding one part of the weave, but the other's the main weaver. So all this stuff was really connected. But thinking about cheese making, right, I just had to purely invent how that might work. Physically, I had to imagine, how would you keep the milk cool? How would you churn it? How would you skim the cream from the whey? How would you... So I just made it up. I have no idea if it could possibly work. But yeah, I had the best time making that up.
That's fantastic. Our next question is, how do you research topics where many of the sources rely on outdated information whose biases may as well be inaccurate as well?
Yeah. The interesting thing for me is when I first began researching Hild and all things Anglo, first of all, there was nothing about Hild. There was that bit in Bede, and then there's one paragraph in the Old English Martyrology, which is probably sourced from the same place that Bede's stuff was, so not very much. So I had to find out about the world. And so I began with basically stuff that was in the public domain, really old-fashioned. The first book I read was from the 1940s. It was a Penguin edition. It was Trevelyan's History of Britain, I think. And so I read that and I thought, well, this is, I know that some of this stuff is wrong. Even now, even I, who knows nothing of history, knows that some of this stuff has been supplanted by fresh info. So then I discovered Stenton and the Anglo-Saxons, and I read that and I thought, oh, now this is much more interesting. And so I sort of took that as gospel for a while. And then I came across an AOL chat group called the Heroic Age. And these were people who were actually, they were young historians, young medievalists, and they were beginning to explore social media, and they were talking about their research and what they'd been learning. And that was the motherlode for me. That was like, now I'm getting the fresh, clean stuff. So from about the late 90s, early 2000s, I started to actually read the most recent things I could find. And having said that, because I had no academic, no institutional access, it was all what I could find in the library and then what I could get through interlibrary loan. And interlibrary loan is slow. You can't keep the books for very long. And you can only get the books that have been published at least 1 year. So I couldn't get fresh stuff. But then Twitter came along and I learned about the beauties of #CanHasPDF. So I would just go research things online and say, hello, can anyone get hold of me this PDF about X? And within a day, I'd have what I needed. So it was wonderful. But now, yes, notions of history change all the time. The tricky part is that historians, actual specialists and current researchers, know what the most recent thing is. But most of my readerly audience do not. Their notions of history are stuck in what they learned at school. So sometimes it's quite hard persuading people that, in fact, yes, women did have power in these days. We can show this through the grave goods and how they were buried and what they were buried with. And in fact, yes, some of them were war leaders. We can show you this through this and this and this. But people they still don't believe it. They're still reading things like George R.R. Martin and thinking, oh yeah, women were just chattel and toys for boys at best, which of course would have been true sometimes in some places, because it still is today, and sometimes in some places, but it would not have been wholly true all the time, everywhere.
What was it about the 7th century Northumbria that first drew you to start writing about it? And do you anticipate spending much more time there?
I'll answer the last bit first. Yes, lots of time. I've got a long way to go with Hild, and I'm loving doing the work. So yes, I'll be there a long time. What drew me to it was, in fact, a visit to Whitby. I grew up in Yorkshire, so I went to all the old abbeys. I went to Revo and Fountains and Kirkstall and Bolton, all those fantastic places. And I used to daydream as a kid. Actually, one of the first things I ever wrote, I was 12, I think. I started a novel. I didn't get very far, obviously, I was 12. I started a novel about, basically a time slip novel about a girl who is crossing the river at Bolton Abbey. And by the time she gets to the other side, she's back in medieval times. But then I couldn't figure out what to do with the plot, so I just left it because I was a kid. But I've always thought of natural history and history as being entwined. So wherever you grow up in the north of England, you are steeped in history. What looks like a natural skyline probably isn't. It's probably been formed over thousands of years by some trailway, or maybe it's a barrow, a bronze, a barrow of some kind. But it's rare that there's any part of the landscape that hasn't been touched throughout history. So I went to Whitby Abbey in my early 20s, and I had never been. But still to this day, can't believe I hadn't been until my early 20s. And I knew there was an abbey, and I knew it was fab, and I climbed to the 199 steps. But there was nothing in the world that could have prepared me for how that place felt. It was astonishing. If there is any place in the world where the skin of the earth is thin and two worlds mix, it's right there. There's something about being on the edge of the cliff and the smell of the sea, the gulls, it's a magical place. It's marvelous. I saw that place and I was instantly consumed by the need to know, who built this place? Where did it come from? And it turned out that it was built by this woman called Hild, which astonished me because it was built in the 7th century, which was the Dark Ages, where women weren't supposed to have any power. So how come she could do it? So that's what set me off. I'm writing these books to find out. I'm writing these books to find out how on earth it was possible for a woman to make all this stuff happen back in a day when we were told that women couldn't do that. So that is my overarching project. And of course, I was born there. I was born in Yorkshire. So to me, it's a wonderful excuse to time travel, to go to a time where there are no contrails in the sky, you can't smell car exhaust, there's no engine noise, and even the birds and trees were different. It's exciting. I love it.
Want to see more from us? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to click like, subscribe, or new content alert.